The music stopped. Not completely, but enough that everyone heard the whisper spreading across the rooftop terrace. Is that Damien's ex-wife? Damien Walker felt the blood drain from his face, because standing near the glass railing of the Manhattan Skyline party was the last woman he ever expected to see again. Naomi Carter, his ex-wife. The woman he had spent 4 years trying to erase from his story. She looked different now. Stronger. Calmer. Dangerous in a way Damien couldn't explain. Her dark skin glowed under the soft gold lights of the rooftop. Her black dress was elegant, simple, and completely unforgettable. Beside him, his fiancée Chloe Whitmore tightened her grip on his arm. "Damien," she whispered, "why is your ex-wife at our engagement party?" Damien forced a laugh. "She's nobody," he said quickly. But even as he said it, Naomi wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were following someone moving through the crowd. Someone important. Someone powerful. Damien turned, and when he saw who was walking toward her, his stomach dropped. Alexander Vail, the billionaire investor who had just funded SwiftGrid with $120 million. The man whose decision could make Damien one of the most powerful founders in tech, or destroy him. Alexander ignored the mayor, ignored the venture capitalists, ignored the entire room, and walked straight to Naomi. Then he smiled, like he had just found the most valuable thing in the building. The party he shouldn't have invited her to. Damien Walker had imagined this night for years. The skyline, the champagne, the investors, the press, the engagement announcement that would seal his image as New York's golden tech founder. Everything was perfect, until Naomi Carter walked in. Damien watched her from across the rooftop, his fingers tightening around his champagne glass. "How did she even get an invitation?" he muttered. Chloe followed his gaze. The jealousy in her voice was immediate. "That's your ex?" Damien forced a casual shrug. "Yeah, she's beautiful." The way Chloe said it made the compliment sound like an accusation. Damien didn't respond, because Naomi wasn't supposed to look like that. When they divorced 4 years ago, she looked exhausted, broken, destroyed. Tonight, she looked like someone who had been quietly winning. Then Alexander Vail stopped in front of her. The billionaire extended his hand. "Naomi Carter," he said. His voice carried easily through the quiet music. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Naomi studied him calmly. "Have you?" "For 6 months." Damien felt his pulse spike. Alexander Vail did not chase people. People chased him. But now he was smiling like a man who had just solved the puzzle. "I've spent half a year trying to understand something," Alexander continued. "What would that be?" "How SwiftGrid built the most advanced logistics prediction engine in the industry." Naomi tilted her head. "And you couldn't figure it out?" "Oh, I did," Alexander said softly. He glanced briefly toward Damien. "Eventually." Across the terrace, Damien felt suddenly exposed, like someone had just opened the door to a room full of secrets. Alexander lowered his voice slightly. "I found the original development files." Naomi didn't react, but Damien's heart slammed inside his chest. "That must have been interesting," she said. Alexander smiled slowly. "Your name was everywhere." Damien suddenly started moving toward them. Fast. Too fast. "Alexander!" he called out. The billionaire didn't even turn. Damien reached them seconds later, breath tight but smile perfectly polished. "Alexander, I didn't realize you'd arrived." Now Alexander looked at him, but the warmth in his expression had vanished. "I didn't come for you." The words landed like a slap. Chloe stepped closer to Damien. "What's going on?" she whispered. Damien ignored her. He turned toward Naomi. "Naomi, this is unexpected." Her eyes met his, calm, unshaken. "Hello, Damien." 4 years. 4 years, and she still knew exactly how to make him feel like the smallest man in the room. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight," he said carefully. "I didn't either," she replied. Alexander chuckled softly. "I invited her." That made Damien freeze. "You what?" Alexander checked his watch casually, because there's something important happening tonight. Damien forced a tight smile. "And what would that be?" Alexander looked between the two former spouses. Then he said the words that made Damien's pulse crash into panic. Correcting a mistake. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "What mistake?" Alexander smiled, the biggest one in Damien Walker's entire career. Behind them, the party lights flickered as staff prepared the presentation screens. A small stage was being assembled near the center of the terrace. Damien felt something cold crawl down his spine. "What presentation?" he asked. Alexander met his eyes. The one where the truth comes out. And for the first time that night, Damien Walker realized something terrifying. Naomi Carter had not come to the party by accident. She came to watch him fall. 4 years earlier, the future of SwiftGrid did not look glamorous. There were no rooftop parties, no investors in tailored suits, no champagne towers or city lights reflecting off glass towers. Just a small warehouse office in Brooklyn that smelled like burnt coffee and overheated computers. Naomi Carter sat cross-legged on the floor with a laptop balanced on her knees, surrounded by whiteboards filled with messy equations and tangled flowcharts. The screens around her displayed columns of shipping data from warehouses across the country. Damien Walker paced the room like a caged animal. "This cannot be right," he said for the third time that night. Naomi did not look up. "It is right. We are losing money on every shipment." "I know." Damien ran a hand through his hair. "Customers are leaving because deliveries are late. Warehouses are overstocking the wrong products. Trucks are driving half empty. Everything is chaos." Naomi finally looked up. "That is exactly the problem." Damien stared at her. "That is not helpful." "It is actually very helpful," she said calmly. She rotated the laptop screen toward him. "Because chaos has patterns." Damien frowned. "What does that even mean?" Naomi tapped the keyboard and lines of data rearranged themselves into a flowing visual map. Shipping routes appeared like glowing veins across the country. Warehouse demand curves began moving in real time. Inventory predictions flickered on the screen. "What you see as chaos," she said softly, "is just information we have not learned how to read yet." Damien stepped closer. The algorithm began adjusting delivery routes automatically. Predicted shortages appeared 2 weeks before they happened. Truck capacity optimized itself across hundreds of locations. Damien's eyes widened slowly. "What is this?" Naomi smiled faintly. "A predictive logistics engine. You build this tonight?" "Not tonight." She leaned back, stretching her arms. "I have been building it for 3 months." Damien stared at the screen like someone discovering fire. "Naomi, this could change everything." She shrugged. "That was the idea." He grabbed her and kissed her suddenly, full of excitement and relief. "You are a genius," he said breathlessly. She laughed. "We are a team." At the time, Damien believed that, or at least he told himself he did. The first investor meeting happened 2 weeks later. They were both nervous. Naomi stood behind him backstage, adjusting his tie, while the room outside filled with venture capitalists. "You ready?" she asked. Damien nodded. "As ready as I will ever be." She handed him the presentation tablet. The entire technical explanation was hers. Every model, every prediction structure, every piece of architecture. "You should present the algorithm part," Damien said. "You understand it better." Naomi shook her head. "You are the founder. They want to hear your vision, and you are the one who built it." She smiled. "They will see that later." The lights dimmed. The host introduced them. Damien walked onto the stage alone. "Good morning," he said confidently. "My name is Damien Walker." He paused dramatically. "And today I am going to show you the future of global logistics." From the back of the room, Naomi watched quietly. At first, she felt proud. Damien spoke well, confident, charming. The investors leaned forward in their seats. Then he reached the slide explaining the algorithm, and something changed. "This predictive engine," Damien said, "is something I have spent the past year developing." Naomi blinked. Her smile faded. The presentation continued. "My breakthrough was realizing that supply chains behave like living systems. My model identifies hidden demand patterns. My algorithm adapts in real time." Each sentence landed like a quiet stone in Naomi's chest. He never said her name, not once. After the meeting, investors crowded around Damien, shaking his hand. "Incredible technology, brilliant concept. You are solving a massive industry problem." Naomi stood nearby, holding the laptop, invisible. Later that night, she found him in the parking garage. "Why did you not mention me?" Damien blinked. "What?" "During the presentation." "Oh," he laughed lightly. "That. Yes, that." He leaned against the car casually. "Naomi, investors do not invest in teams. They invest in leaders. You are the leader. I am the founder, and I build the technology, and you are an essential part of the company." She stared at him. "But they do not need to know every detail," he continued. "They need one story, one face." He tapped his chest. "That face is me." Naomi did not argue, not then. But it did not stop there. Press interviews came next. Damien sat under studio lights explaining his vision. Naomi appeared in the background of one article as his brilliant wife who occasionally assists with technical development. She read that line 3 times. Assist. Board meetings followed. Whenever Naomi presented improvements to the system, Damien summarized them afterward as strategic leadership decisions. Then came the patents. That was the moment everything broke. Naomi found the documents late one night at their kitchen table. Stacks of legal filings, technical diagrams, her entire system, her code architecture, her mathematical models, all filed under one name, Damien Walker, primary inventor. Naomi sat there until sunrise. When Damien came downstairs for coffee, she slid the papers across the table. "Explain this." He barely glanced at them. "It is standard procedure." "Standard procedure for what?" "For the company to hold the intellectual property. You are listed as the inventor. I am the chief executive." Naomi's voice remained calm. "I created that engine. The company paid you while you built it. I was your partner. You were an employee of the company." The words hung in the air like smoke. Naomi looked at him carefully. When did that change? Damien sighed. Why are you making this emotional? Because it is. This is business. She leaned back slowly. No, she said quietly. This is theft. Damien's expression hardened. Be careful with that word. Then use a different one. He folded his arms. What do you want, Naomi? She looked at him for a long time. Then she said the sentence neither of them expected. I want a divorce. Damien laughed at first. You are angry. Yes. You will calm down. No. He finally realized she was serious. You are walking away from everything we built? Naomi stood up. No. She looked him straight in the eyes. I am walking away from what you turned it into. The divorce took 6 months. Lawyers, contracts, negotiations. In the end, Naomi accepted almost nothing. No money, no shares, no control of the company she built. But she added one small paragraph deep inside the legal paperwork. A paragraph so buried in legal language that Damien's attorneys barely noticed it. Then she signed the documents and walked away. Damien watched her leave believing he had won. He had the company, the technology, the future. What he did not realize was that Naomi Carter had just made the smartest investment of her life. And 4 years later, it was about to pay off. The divorce ended quietly. There were no dramatic courtroom confrontations, no screaming arguments across polished wooden tables. By the time the lawyers finished negotiating, the marriage between Damien Walker and Naomi Carter felt less like a relationship ending and more like a business contract dissolving. They sat across from each other in a neutral conference room in Midtown Manhattan. The window behind Naomi framed the gray winter skyline. Snow drifted slowly past the glass like something trying to erase the city. Damien's lawyer, Martin Ellison, flipped through the final documents with practiced efficiency. Everything appears straightforward, he said. His voice carried the bored confidence of a man who had handled hundreds of divorces between ambitious professionals who believed their lives were more dramatic than they actually were. Damien leaned back in his chair. He looked relaxed, almost relieved. The company had finally started stabilizing after months of near collapse. SwiftGrid was still far from profitable, but new contracts had begun trickling in. Investors were showing cautious interest again, and most importantly, the intellectual property was secure. Naomi sat quietly across the table. Her posture was calm, her expression unreadable. If she felt anything about the end of their marriage, she did not show it. Martin slid a sheet of paper toward her. This document confirms the asset division, he said. The company SwiftGrid remains entirely under Mr. Walker's ownership. Naomi nodded. I understand. You will not receive equity in the company. I know. Damien watched her carefully. He had expected more resistance, more anger. Instead, she seemed strangely detached. Martin continued reading through the clauses. Personal assets will be divided according to the previously agreed schedule. There will be no spousal support. Both parties waive future financial claims related to SwiftGrid operations. Naomi listened patiently. When he finished, she picked up a pen. Before I sign, she said, I would like to add one clause. Damien's eyebrows lifted slightly. Martin looked up from the papers. What kind of clause? Just a contingency, Damien shrugged. As long as it does not complicate things. Naomi pulled a small folder from her bag and slid a printed page across the table. Martin adjusted his glasses and read. His expression did not change. Damien glanced at the page briefly. The language was dense and filled with legal terminology. Recognition of intellectual property developed during marriage. Contingent equity activation. Future capital events. It looked like standard technical wording that lawyers use to cover unlikely situations. Martin leaned back. This clause states that if SwiftGrid receives significant capital investment in the future, a contingent equity allocation of 20% would transfer to Miss Carter. Damien frowned. 20%? Naomi met his eyes. Only if the company receives major funding. Martin tapped the paper thoughtfully. The clause specifies a capital event exceeding $100 million. Damien laughed. SwiftGrid is barely surviving. Martin nodded. At present, the company valuation is extremely low. Exactly, Damien said. He turned to Naomi. So this clause would never activate. Probably not, she agreed. Then why include it? Damien asked. Naomi's voice remained calm. Because the predictive engine was built during our marriage. Damien sighed. Naomi, we already settled the intellectual property issue. This clause simply acknowledges that. Martin read through the page again. From a legal perspective, it was structured carefully but posed no immediate threat. The company was nearly bankrupt. Raising $100 million in investment was almost impossible for a struggling logistics startup. And even if it happened years later, future investors would likely restructure ownership anyway. Martin placed the paper back on the table. There is minimal risk in accepting this clause. Damien shrugged. If it helps you move on. Naomi nodded once. That is the idea. Martin added the paragraph to the final contract. It became Section 12, subsection C, buried deep inside 20 pages of legal language. Then the papers were printed again. Damien signed first. His signature was bold and confident. When he finished, he pushed the documents across the table. Naomi picked up the pen. For a moment she studied Damien's signature. Then she signed her name below it. Naomi Carter. The letters were neat and deliberate. When the final document was completed, Martin gathered the pages together. "Well," he said professionally, "that concludes the legal dissolution of your marriage." Damien stood. "So that is it?" "Yes." He turned toward Naomi. For a brief moment something softer flickered in his expression. "Good luck," he said. Naomi stood as well. "Goodbye, Damien." Then she walked out of the room without looking back. At the time, Damien believed he had won. He had the company, the technology, the patents, the future. Naomi had walked away with nothing. Or at least, that was what he thought. Years passed. SwiftGrid survived by sheer stubbornness. Damien worked relentlessly to grow the company. Gradually, the prediction engine Naomi built began outperforming every competitor in the logistics industry. Warehouses could anticipate demand weeks ahead. Shipping routes optimized themselves automatically. Major retailers began signing contracts. Revenue climbed. Media outlets started calling Damien a visionary, the genius behind the most advanced supply chain algorithm in America. He appeared on magazine covers, spoke at technology conferences. Investors started paying attention. But the real turning point came when Alexander Vail entered the picture. Vail was not just another venture capitalist. He was one of the most powerful investors in the technology world. When he invested in a company, the entire industry paid attention, and for months he had been quietly studying SwiftGrid, analyzing its predictive engine, examining its architecture. Something about the system fascinated him. The mathematical elegance, the unusual coding structure. It did not match Damien Walker's public reputation. Alexander had built his career by identifying hidden brilliance, and SwiftGrid's technology felt like the work of someone extraordinary, someone Damien had never mentioned. So Alexander started digging deeper. Old development logs, archived code repositories, early prototypes. What he found surprised him. The original algorithm files were labeled with a different name, Naomi Carter. Even though later versions had removed her authorship, traces remained, digital fingerprints hidden inside the system. The deeper Alexander investigated, the clearer the truth became. SwiftGrid's most valuable technology had not been created by Damien Walker. It had been built by the woman who vanished from the company 4 years earlier. Alexander kept digging, and eventually he discovered the divorce contract. Section 12, subsection C. The clause Damien's lawyers had ignored. Alexander leaned back in his office chair the moment he finished reading it. Then he laughed. Because 3 days earlier he had finalized a massive investment deal. SwiftGrid had just received $120 million in funding, which meant something very interesting had just happened. Without realizing it, Damien Walker had triggered the contingency clause Naomi Carter signed years ago. 20% equity in SwiftGrid now legally belonged to her, the second largest ownership stake in the entire company. Alexander closed the document slowly. For a long moment, he simply stared out the window at the Manhattan skyline. Then he picked up his phone. He sent a message to Naomi Carter, a short one, only one sentence. "You may want to attend Damien's engagement party tonight." Back on the rooftop terrace, 4 years later, Damien Walker stood watching the stage being prepared in the center of the party. His chest felt tight. Alexander Vail stood nearby with Naomi, speaking quietly. The billionaire glanced toward Damien with a faint smile. And Damien suddenly understood something terrible. That strange clause Naomi added during the divorce. The one nobody took seriously. The one buried deep inside the contract. It had just come back to life. Because 3 days ago, Alexander Vail invested $120 million into SwiftGrid, which meant Naomi Carter now owned 20% of his company, and Damien Walker had not even realized it yet. The stage lights flickered on. The presentation screens came to life. Alexander checked his watch calmly. Then he said the words that made Damien's blood run cold. "I believe it is time everyone learns the truth." The rooftop terrace slowly transformed from a celebration into something far more tense. Guests who had been laughing over champagne moments earlier now drifted toward the center stage with quiet curiosity. Investors, journalists, and industry executives filled the rows of chairs that staff had arranged while the party music faded into the background. Large screens flickered to life above the stage. Damien Walker stood near the back of the crowd, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Alexander Vail. Something about the situation felt wrong. Very wrong. Alexander stepped up to the small podium with effortless confidence, the kind of calm that only belonged to men who controlled entire industries. "Good evening," he began smoothly. His voice carried across the terrace with practiced authority. "I apologize for interrupting what was supposed to be a wonderful engagement celebration." Polite laughter rippled through the audience. Alexander smiled faintly. "But occasionally, the best way to celebrate the future is by correcting the past." Damien felt a cold sensation creep up his spine. Alexander continued speaking. "As many of you know, 3 days ago, my firm finalized the $120 million investment into SwiftGrid. Applause broke out immediately. Damien forced a smile and nodded to the crowd, raising his glass slightly in acknowledgement. The applause faded. Alexander leaned lightly against the podium. SwiftGrid's predictive logistics system is one of the most remarkable technologies I have seen in years. Damien relaxed slightly. That part, at least, was expected. But when I first examined the platform, Alexander continued, something about it did not make sense. The room grew quiet. The algorithm architecture was unusually elegant. The demand prediction models were extremely intuitive. The coding patterns revealed a mind that understood complex systems in a rare way. He paused. And the more I studied it, the more one question bothered me. Alexander looked directly at Damien. Who actually built it? A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Damien's smile tightened. Alexander, he said loudly from the audience, I would be happy to walk everyone through the development process another time. Alexander shook his head gently. That will not be necessary. He pressed a button on the podium. The large screens behind him suddenly filled with lines of computer code. Complex algorithms scrolled across the displays like digital waterfalls. Several engineers in the crowd leaned forward immediately, recognizing the structure. This, Alexander said calmly, is the original architecture of SwiftGrid's adaptive logistics engine. The code paused on a particular section. Alexander zoomed in. A small tag appeared in the corner of the screen. Author, N. Carter. A murmur swept through the audience. Alexander tapped another key. More code appeared. Older development files, version histories, technical documentation. Each one carried variations of the same name. Naomi Carter. Damien's stomach dropped. Alexander continued speaking in the same measured tone. When I reviewed SwiftGrid's public records, I noticed something curious. He tapped the screen again. The next file appeared. The same algorithm structure. But the author field had been edited. The name Naomi Carter had been removed, replaced with a different one. Damien Walker. A sharp intake of breath spread through the room. Alexander folded his hands together. Someone went to considerable effort to remove the original creator's name from these files. He glanced toward Damien. Unfortunately, they were not very thorough. A few journalists were already typing rapidly on their phones. Damien pushed through the crowd toward the stage. This is completely inappropriate, he snapped. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Is it? You are presenting internal development material without context. Alexander tilted his head. Please provide the context then. Damien's voice sharpened. SwiftGrid is the result of years of collaborative work by a talented team. Alexander nodded slowly. That sounds reasonable. He turned back toward the screens. Except the early development files show something different. Another document appeared. A series of prototype models dated 4 years earlier. Every single one labeled with the same author. Naomi Carter. Alexander stepped away from the podium and walked slowly across the stage. When I first saw this name, he said, I assumed Naomi Carter must be a senior engineer at SwiftGrid. He looked out over the audience. So imagine my surprise when I discovered she has not worked at the company for 4 years. The crowd shifted uneasily. Damien's face had gone pale. Alexander continued calmly. She did not leave because the company no longer needed her. He paused. She left because she divorced the founder. A stunned silence fell over the terrace. Dozens of eyes turned toward Naomi. She stood near the edge of the crowd, calm and composed, as if none of this surprised her at all. Alexander gestured gently toward her. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, this is Naomi Carter. More whispers spread through the audience. Alexander's voice grew slightly sharper. The woman who designed the core predictive architecture of SwiftGrid's technology. Damien finally reached the stage. That is not accurate, he said tightly. Alexander faced him. Then explain these development records. They are early prototypes. They are the foundation of your entire platform. Damien's jaw clenched. Naomi contributed to the project. I have never denied that. Alexander gave a soft laugh. Really? He tapped the screen again. A collection of press interviews appeared. Magazine covers, conference speeches. In each one, Damien described the system as his personal breakthrough. Not once did Naomi appear. Not once did her name appear in the credits. Alexander gestured toward the images. Curiously, you seem to have forgotten to mention her. Damien's voice dropped. This conversation should happen privately. Alexander's smile faded. No. He looked back at the crowd. Because the truth does not belong in private. The tension on the rooftop had become suffocating. Investors exchanged uncertain looks. Journalists moved closer to the stage. The narrative of SwiftGrid's rise was suddenly unraveling in front of them. Alexander turned toward Naomi. Would you care to join me? For a moment she remained still. Then Naomi walked forward slowly through the crowd. Every eye followed her. She stepped onto the stage with quiet confidence. Alexander moved aside so she could stand at the podium. Damien stared at her as if seeing her for the first time in years. "You planned this," he said quietly. Naomi met his gaze. "No." Her voice was calm. "You planned this." The words hit him harder than anything Alexander had said. Alexander folded his arms thoughtfully. "The tragedy here is not that Damien built a successful company." He looked at the audience. "The tragedy is that the brilliance behind it was hidden." He turned toward Naomi. "Until now." The room had grown so quiet that the distant sounds of the city below seemed louder than the people standing only feet apart. And for the first time that night, many of the guests began to understand something unsettling. The empire Damien Walker had spent years building might have been constructed on someone else's genius. Someone he tried very hard to erase. And that someone was now standing right beside him on stage, with the truth finally beginning to surface. For several long seconds no one spoke. The rooftop terrace remained wrapped in a heavy silence that felt almost physical. Naomi stood at the podium, calm and composed, while Damien stared at her from only a few feet away, the tension in his face growing harder with every passing moment. Alexander Vail slowly returned to the center of the stage, his hands loosely folded behind his back as he looked out over the crowd. "I believe there is one more important detail everyone here should understand," he said calmly. A few journalists lifted their phones higher, already recording. Damien exhaled sharply. "Alexander, enough," he said through clenched teeth. "This presentation has made your point." Alexander turned his head slightly toward him. "No," he said evenly, "it has not." He pressed a button on the podium. A new document appeared on the screens behind them, a scanned legal contract. Several investors leaned forward immediately. Alexander highlighted a section near the bottom of the document. 4 years ago, he said, when Naomi Carter and Damien Walker finalized their divorce, a contingency clause was quietly added to the agreement. Damien's stomach dropped. He recognized the document instantly. Alexander continued. "The clause states that if SwiftGrid ever receives a capital investment exceeding $100 million, Naomi Carter automatically receives 20% equity in the company." A wave of shocked murmurs exploded through the crowd. Damien stepped forward. "That clause is meaningless," he snapped. "It was never meant to be activated." Alexander smiled faintly. "Perhaps." He tapped the screen again. "But 3 days ago my firm invested $120 million into SwiftGrid." The room erupted. Investors turned toward Damien in disbelief. Several board members exchanged stunned looks. Chloe Whitmore's hand tightened around Damien's arm. "What is he talking about?" she whispered. Damien did not answer. Alexander's voice cut clearly through the rising noise. "Which means that as of this morning, Naomi Carter legally owns 20% of SwiftGrid." He paused. "And that makes her the second largest shareholder in the company." The words seemed to suck the air out of the terrace. Damien's face had gone completely pale. "That is impossible," he said hoarsely. Alexander folded his arms. "Your own attorneys approved the clause." "They never expected SwiftGrid to succeed," Damien shot back. "That does not change the contract." The murmurs grew louder. Journalists were already sending messages to their editors. The story unfolding on this rooftop was quickly becoming far bigger than an engagement party. Chloe slowly stepped away from Damien. Her eyes moved between him and Naomi. "You told me you built everything," she said quietly. Damien turned toward her. "Chloe, this is complicated." "Is it?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Because it sounds like you built your company using someone else's work." Damien's expression hardened. "That is not what happened." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Then please explain what did happen." Damien looked around the room. Dozens of faces stared back at him. Investors who had trusted him. Reporters who had praised him. People who believed the story he had told for years. And suddenly that story no longer seemed solid. He opened his mouth to respond, but Naomi spoke first. "I did not come here to destroy SwiftGrid," she said calmly. Her voice carried easily through the crowd. "I came because Alexander told me something interesting this morning." She glanced briefly at the billionaire beside her. "He said the truth deserves witnesses." She looked back at Damien. "And tonight there are plenty of them." Alexander nodded slightly. That was the idea. He stepped closer to Naomi. For a moment the two of them simply looked at each other. Then Alexander said something that no one in the room expected. "I have admired your work for a very long time." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "I first saw your mathematical modeling when you were working at the Brooklyn incubator," he said. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition. "That was years ago." "Yes," Alexander smiled. "You rewrote an entire logistics framework overnight because you thought their system was inefficient." Naomi laughed softly. "It was inefficient. I remember thinking at the time that whoever hired you would become very rich." He glanced briefly toward Damien. "Apparently, I was right." The tension in the air shifted slightly, but Damien's anger only deepened. "This is turning into a circus," he snapped. Alexander ignored him. Instead, he turned fully toward Naomi. "And there is something else I have been meaning to do." Naomi tilted her head. "What is that?" Alexander reached for her hand. The movement was slow, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. The crowd fell completely silent. Damien stared in disbelief. Alexander gently lifted Naomi's hand and looked at her with a quiet intensity. "These hands built one of the most elegant technological systems I have ever seen," he said. "And for 4 years no one gave you credit for it." Naomi did not pull away. Her eyes searched his face. "And what exactly are you planning to do about that?" Alexander smiled. "Start correcting the mistake." Then, before anyone could react, he leaned forward and kissed her. The kiss was brief, but unmistakable. A sharp wave of gasps moved through the crowd. Camera flashes exploded across the terrace. Damien froze as if someone had struck him. Chloe's hand slipped completely from his arm. She stared at him with wide eyes. "You told me she was just your ex-wife," she whispered. Damien could not look away from Naomi and Alexander. "Chloe," but she was no longer listening. Her gaze moved toward the stage where Naomi now stood beside the most powerful investor in the room. For the first time, Chloe seemed to see the situation clearly. "You did not just divorce her," she said slowly. "You erased her." Damien's silence confirmed everything. Chloe stepped back from him as if he had suddenly become a stranger. Around them, the crowd buzzed with excitement. The image of the billionaire kissing the woman behind Swiftbit's technology was already spreading across social media. Reporters were shouting questions. Investors were whispering urgently among themselves. And at the center of it all, Damien Walker stood frozen. The carefully crafted image of the brilliant founder was cracking in real time. Alexander finally stepped back from Naomi, his expression calm. "That," he said quietly, "was long overdue." Naomi shook her head slightly, though a faint smile touched her lips. "You enjoy dramatic moments." Alexander glanced around the terrace where chaos had already begun to spread. "I prefer accurate ones," Damien finally found his voice again. "This is not over," he said harshly. Alexander turned toward him. "No," he agreed calmly. "It is just beginning." And for the first time that night, Damien realized something terrifying. The engagement party meant to celebrate his future had turned into the moment his past caught up with him, and everyone in the room had just watched it happen. The engagement party ended in chaos. Within minutes of Alexander Vale's announcement, the rooftop terrace had transformed from a celebration into a battlefield of whispers, phone calls, and hurried exits. Journalists rushed toward the elevators, already sending breaking updates to their editors. Investors gathered in tight circles, speaking in low, urgent voices. Even the music had stopped, as if the party itself understood that the night had turned into something entirely different. Damien Walker remained near the stage long after Naomi and Alexander had disappeared into the crowd. His hands were clenched so tightly that the champagne glass he still held finally cracked between his fingers. Chloe noticed. "Damien," she said carefully. He did not look at her. "What?" "You need to tell me the truth." "I already have." "No," she said quietly. "You told me your version." That made him turn. "And what exactly do you think happened?" Chloe hesitated. For the first time since they met, she seemed unsure of the man standing in front of her. "I think," she said slowly, "that you built your company on something that was not entirely yours." Damien's jaw tightened. That is what Alexander wants people to believe. "And Naomi?" He did not answer. Chloe studied his silence for a long moment. Then she stepped back. "I need some air." She walked toward the elevator without looking back. Damien watched her leave. For a moment, he considered following her. But another thought pushed through his mind with brutal clarity. SwiftGrid, the company, the investors. If Naomi truly controlled 20% of the shares now, everything was about to become very complicated. His phone began vibrating in his pocket. Then it started vibrating again and again. By the time Damien checked the screen, he already had 15 missed calls. Lawyers, board members, investors. The war had already begun. The emergency board meeting happened the next morning. The conference room inside SwiftGrid's headquarters felt colder than usual. Damien arrived early, but Alexander Vale was already there, sitting calmly at the long glass table with a tablet in front of him. Naomi sat beside him. When Damien entered the room, every conversation stopped. Board members looked between the three of them like witnesses waiting for a trial to begin. Damien placed his folder on the table. "Let us get something clear immediately," he said. "That divorce clause is legally questionable." Alexander leaned back in his chair. 3 law firms disagree." Damien ignored him and looked toward the company's general counsel. "Julia?" The lawyer cleared her throat. "The clause appears valid." Damien's voice sharpened. "Appears? It was approved by both parties during the divorce settlement, and no one noticed it? It was buried inside the agreement." Damien slammed his hand lightly on the table. "This is ridiculous." Alexander spoke calmly. "No, it is expensive." Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Naomi had not spoken yet. She simply watched the exchange with quiet patience. Finally, Damien turned toward her. What exactly do you want? Naomi met his gaze. The same thing I wanted 4 years ago. And what is that? Recognition. The room remained silent. Damien laughed bitterly. You humiliated me in front of the entire industry. I corrected the record. You destroyed my engagement party. Naomi's voice stayed calm. You destroyed our partnership long before that. Alexander folded his hands together. This conversation is not about personal feelings. He looked around the table. It is about the future of SwiftGrid. One of the board members leaned forward. The media situation is already escalating. Another added quietly. The story is everywhere this morning. Damien glanced at a large screen mounted on the wall. Several news articles were displayed. Tech founder accused of erasing co-creator. Billionaire investor exposes company secrets. Who really built SwiftGrid? Damien's chest tightened. This is temporary, he said sharply. We will issue a statement clarifying Naomi's role in early development. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Early development? Damien's voice hardened. You contributed. That is not the same as building the entire system. Alexander looked amused. The code files disagree. Damien turned toward the board again. This is exactly why we need to control the narrative. And how do you plan to do that? Someone asked. Media management, legal clarification, strategic communication. Alexander gave a soft laugh. You mean damage control? Yes. Alexander shook his head slowly. That approach might have worked yesterday. He gestured toward Naomi. But today she owns 20% of your company. One of the board members spoke up cautiously. That also means Naomi has voting rights. Another nodded. And Alexander controls the largest investment stake. The realization settled heavily across the room. Damien suddenly understood the shift in power. For years he had controlled every decision. Now two people sitting across the table from him could challenge that control. Alexander leaned forward slightly. I did not invest $120 million into SwiftGrid to protect your reputation. He spoke calmly. I invested in the technology. His gaze moved briefly toward Naomi. And the mind behind it. Damien's hands tightened. So what are you proposing? Alexander looked at the board. A structural adjustment. Several members straightened immediately. What kind of adjustment? One asked. Naomi Carter will join the executive leadership team as head of development. The room erupted in quiet murmurs. Damien shook his head immediately. No. Alexander remained calm. She built the system. She understands it better than anyone. That is not the point. It is exactly the point. Damien looked around the table. You cannot seriously be considering this. One of the older board members spoke carefully. The technology is the company's most valuable asset. Another added, if Naomi truly created the core architecture, her involvement could stabilize investor confidence. Damien stared at them. You are siding with them? We are siding with the company. The words felt like a betrayal. Alexander watched Damien with a thoughtful expression. You spent years building a story about yourself. Damien's voice dropped. And now you are trying to rewrite it. No, Alexander said quietly. I am revealing the original version. Naomi finally spoke again. I am not here to take your job, Damien. His eyes snapped toward her. Then why are you here? She held his gaze steadily. Because this company deserves the truth. Another silence filled the room. This time it felt different. Less uncertain, more decisive. The balance of power was shifting. Slowly, but unmistakably. Damien could see it in the board members' faces. The loyalty he once commanded without question was beginning to fracture. And across the table, Naomi Carter sat quietly beside the billionaire who had just changed everything. For the first time since founding SwiftGrid, Damien Walker was no longer the most powerful person in the room, and he could feel control slipping through his fingers. The first leak appeared 2 days after the board meeting. At 6:30 in the morning, a technology journalist published an article with a headline that spread across the industry within minutes. The forgotten engineer behind SwiftGrid. Damien saw it while standing in his kitchen, staring down at his phone as the coffee machine hummed quietly behind him. At first he thought it was just another opinion piece riding the wave of the party scandal. Then he opened the article. His stomach dropped. The journalist had obtained internal emails from the earliest days of SwiftGrid. Emails Damien thought had been deleted years ago. One message was dated 4 years earlier. From Naomi Carter to Damien Walker. Subject: Adaptive Prediction Model Update. The message contained a detailed explanation of the algorithm architecture Naomi had designed. Attached were diagrams showing the exact mathematical structure that later became SwiftGrid's core system. Below the message was Damien's reply. Looks great. Let me present this to investors tomorrow. They will understand it better coming from me. The article continued. Another email. Another set of development files. Version histories showing Naomi's name attached to hundreds of early code commits. The journalist wrote carefully, but the implication was unmistakable. The public narrative surrounding SwiftGrid's creation had not matched the internal record. Damien felt the familiar surge of anger rising in his chest. Someone was feeding these documents to the press. His phone began vibrating, then vibrating again. Investors, board members, reporters. The media storm had begun. By noon, 3 more articles had appeared. One of them contained screenshots from early product presentations. The slides were labeled with Naomi's initials. Another article quoted a former SwiftGrid engineer who had worked at the company during its earliest days. The real genius was Naomi, the engineer said. Everyone inside the office knew it. The story spread across business networks and social media platforms with terrifying speed. Television commentators debated the situation live on air. Was Damien Walker the visionary founder he claimed to be, or did he simply take credit for someone else's innovation? By late afternoon, the term golden founder began appearing in headlines, not as praise, as sarcasm. Damien sat in his office watching the damage unfold across the large monitor on his desk. His public relations team stood nearby, speaking in urgent whispers. "We need to release a statement immediately," one of them said. "Deny the allegations." Another shook his head. "The documents look authentic. They are taken out of context." "Then we need the context." Damien rubbed his temples. The problem was that the context was not much better. Across the building, Naomi Carter sat inside the development floor for the first time in 4 years. The engineering team had gathered around her workstation earlier that morning. At first, the atmosphere had been tense. Many of the developers had only known Naomi through rumors. The mysterious co-creator who disappeared. The name that occasionally appeared in old files. But the tension did not last long. Within an hour, Naomi was already reviewing the system architecture with them. The engineers quickly realized something. She understood the platform in a way no one else did. A young programmer pointed to a section of code. This prediction loop keeps creating instability in high-volume scenarios. Naomi leaned forward slightly. That is because the weight balancing factor was modified. The engineer blinked. "How did you know that?" She smiled faintly. "Because I wrote the original version." She typed quickly, adjusting several lines. The simulation instantly stabilized. Several engineers exchanged surprised looks. Another developer spoke up. "We have been trying to fix that issue for months." Naomi leaned back in her chair. The system was never designed to handle that much data without restructuring the predictive layers. She looked around the room. "Which means we need to rebuild part of the architecture." One engineer hesitated. "That could take weeks." Naomi shook her head. 3 days. The room fell silent. Then she smiled slightly. "Trust me." Downstairs, Damien's problems continued multiplying. A second wave of leaked material hit the media that evening. This time it included internal meeting notes from early investor pitches. In several of them, Damien described the predictive engine as his personal breakthrough. One particular quote spread rapidly online. "The algorithm is something I developed after months of research into supply chain inefficiencies." The quote was followed by another email exchange from Naomi. "I thought we agreed the investors would know I built the predictive model." Damien's response appeared directly below. "Investors prefer a single narrative. Let me handle the presentation." The internet reaction was immediate. Commentators began questioning Damien's entire public image. Technology forums filled with discussions about the ethics of founder storytelling. Some defended Damien, others accused him of intellectual theft. Inside SwiftGrid's offices, the atmosphere had shifted. Employees spoke more carefully. Some avoided Damien entirely in the hallways. Meanwhile, Naomi's development team worked late into the night, rebuilding parts of the system she had originally designed. By the third day, the engineering floor felt energized in a way it had not in years. Problems that had frustrated the team for months were suddenly being solved. The algorithm ran faster, prediction accuracy improved, logistics simulation stabilized. One engineer shook his head in amazement. This system suddenly makes sense again. Naomi simply continued working. She had not spoken to the press. She had not posted anything online. She focused entirely on the technology. Alexander Vail visited the office that afternoon. He stood behind Naomi for a moment, watching the engineers working around her. "You look comfortable here," he said. Naomi glanced up. "I built most of it." Alexander smiled. "And now you are fixing it." "Someone had to." He leaned against the desk beside her. "The board is becoming nervous." "About the media?" "About Damien." Naomi returned her attention to the screen. "That is not my concern." Alexander studied her for a moment. "You do not seem interested in revenge." She paused. Then she said quietly, "Revenge wastes energy." "What do you prefer?" "Solutions." Alexander laughed softly. "That might be why the company works better when you are here." Across the building, Damien Walker sat alone in his office, staring at the latest headline appearing on his screen. SwiftGrid board considers leadership changes amid scandal. For years, he had carefully constructed his public identity. The visionary founder, the brilliant strategist, the man who built a revolutionary company from nothing. Now that image was collapsing piece by piece. Emails, documents, witnesses. Each new revelation chipped away at the story he had told the world. And the most painful part was happening just one floor above him. The company was improving, not because of him, but because Naomi Carter had returned. For the first time since founding SwiftGrid, Damian Walker felt the ground beneath his career beginning to crumble. And he could not stop it. The board meeting that ended Damian Walker's career as chief executive lasted less than 40 minutes. The conference room felt different from the previous meetings. There was no uncertainty this time, no hesitation. The media storm had not slowed. If anything, it had grown stronger. Another wave of leaked documents had appeared the night before. Internal communications, development logs, and early technical presentations, all pointing to the same uncomfortable conclusion. SwiftGrid's most valuable technology had been created by Naomi Carter. The board members had spent the entire morning reviewing investor reactions. Several major partners had already requested clarification about leadership. A few hinted they might reconsider their contracts if the company did not stabilize quickly. Alexander Vail sat quietly at the far end of the table, observing everything with calm detachment. Naomi sat beside him, listening without interruption. Damian stood near the window overlooking Manhattan. He had not slept. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered. When the chairman of the board finally spoke, his voice was careful but firm. Damian, we appreciate what you have built here. Damian did not turn around. Built, he repeated quietly. Yes, the chairman continued, but the company is entering a new phase. Damian already knew what was coming. He had seen the shift happening over the past week. The board members who once defended him were now studying the numbers instead of his words. Investors trusted results more than narratives, and the results since Naomi's return had been undeniable. The predictive system had improved dramatically. Client satisfaction numbers were rising again. Engineers across the company had begun implementing the structural changes Naomi designed. Even Alexander's investment group had publicly praised the technological upgrades. The chairman continued. In order to restore confidence with investors and partners, the board believes a leadership transition is necessary. Damian finally turned. So that is it. Another board member spoke quietly. We are asking you to step down as chief executive. The words hung in the room like a final verdict. For several seconds, Damian said nothing. He looked around the table. These were the same people who had celebrated his vision, praised his ambition, and applauded his presentations for years. Now, their eyes avoided his. Only Naomi met his gaze. There was no anger in her expression, only calm. Damian gave a quiet laugh. You are really doing this? The chairman nodded slowly. The company needs stability. Damian looked toward Alexander. You orchestrated this. Alexander shook his head slightly. You did. Damian's jaw tightened. By investing in the company? By ignoring the truth for 4 years. Silence filled the room again. Finally, Damian straightened his jacket. Fine, he said, if that is what the board wants. The chairman exhaled softly. We appreciate your cooperation. Damian gathered his papers, but before leaving the room, he looked once more at Naomi. You got what you wanted. She shook her head. No. His eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? I wanted recognition, she said calmly. This is just the result of it. Damian studied her face for a moment, then he left the room without another word. The press conference happened 2 hours later. SwiftGrid's headquarters lobby had been transformed into a temporary media stage. Cameras filled the space. Reporters crowded behind barricades, eager to capture the conclusion of a story that had dominated technology news for an entire week. The company logo glowed brightly on a large screen behind the podium. Alexander Vail stood to one side, speaking quietly with the board chairman. When Naomi entered the room, the reporters immediately began shouting questions. Is it true Damian Walker stepped down? Did you really build the SwiftGrid algorithm alone? Will you become the new chief executive? Flashes from cameras lit the room like bursts of lightning. Naomi paused for a moment near the stage. She had never cared about public attention. For years she had preferred the quiet certainty of code and mathematics. But this moment was different. This moment was about truth. Alexander stepped beside her. Ready? He asked. Naomi smiled faintly. I think so. They walked onto the stage together. The room slowly grew quiet as Naomi stepped behind the podium. The board chairman made a brief announcement confirming Damian Walker's resignation as chief executive. Then he stepped aside. Naomi faced the crowd of reporters. For a moment, she simply looked at them. Hundreds of cameras waited for her to speak. Questions buzzed through the room like electricity. Finally, she leaned slightly toward the microphone. I know many of you have questions, she said calmly. Her voice carried clearly across the room. But this situation is actually very simple. She paused briefly. 4 years ago, I helped build a predictive logistics system for SwiftGrid. She glanced briefly at the large screen behind her, where an image of the algorithm architecture appeared. I believed we were building something together. The reporters listened carefully, but over time the story changed. She folded her hands lightly on the podium. My verb became someone else's achievement. Another brief pause. But the technology never forgot who built it. Several journalists exchanged quick looks. Naomi continued. When Alexander Vale began studying the system, he found the truth hidden inside the code. She looked toward Alexander for a moment. He chose to reveal it. The room remained silent. Then Naomi said the words that would soon appear in headlines around the world. 4 years ago, Damien told me something during an investor presentation. She paused. He said investors believe in one face and one story. The reporters leaned forward. Naomi allowed the silence to stretch for just a moment. Then she finished the thought. This time, she said softly, they chose the right one. The room erupted. Camera flashes exploded across the stage. Reporters shouted questions again. But Naomi stepped back from the microphone. Alexander placed a supportive hand lightly on her shoulder. Across the room, the large SwiftGrid logo glowed brightly behind them. For years, Damien Walker had been the public face of that symbol, the visionary founder, the golden success story. Now that image had changed, not through revenge, not through anger, but through something far more powerful, the truth. And Naomi Carter stood calmly at the center of it, the woman who had quietly believed in her own brilliance when no one else did, the woman who walked away when she was erased, the woman who waited patiently until the world was finally ready to see her, the woman who bet on herself and won.